A great night for reform, a good night for the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, a bad night for Labour, a catastrophic evening for the Conservatives. We're going to take a look back at last Thursday's UK polls, as well as casting our eyes internationally and seeing what's been happening in Canada, Australia and Romania. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Yes, welcome back to the Downtown Den and the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. And Frank McKenna here on a bank holiday Monday, dressed casually. So apologies to anybody who's expecting to see me in a shirt and a tie. Not going to happen on a bank holiday, I'm afraid. Delighted to be joined as ever by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. Jim, looking very smart now, but I tell you, listeners, 5 minutes ago, he looked like a right bloody scruff.
I look like you.
I thought we'd gone onto the scene of Steptoe and Son. But anyway, moving on quickly. So those local election results, the by-election mayoralties, it was, as I said in the introduction there, a great night for reform, poor night for Labour, of course, decent night for the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and a catastrophic night for the Conservatives. Where do we start trying to unpick this? And firstly, can I ask the question of you both? Where does this leave two-party politics in this country? Do we think that this is simply a protest vote, sort of 10 months into a new government, that has not, as we've said on many occasions on this podcast, covered itself in glory in its early days? Or is this a signal of things to come? Are we actually starting to see the beginnings of multi-party politics in this country? I'll start with you, Jim, because you've been trawling through the polls and the results from Thursday evening. What do you reckon? Do you think that this is an STP moment when everyone thought two-party system had been blown up? Or do we think actually this is something a bit more serious and sustainable for Reform, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats?
Well, that is the comparison, isn't it? The SDP, Crosby by-election, Shirley Williams elected, Mrs. Thatcher very unpopular in 1982. Everyone thought this was the change, and obviously it was the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, came from a serious split in the Labour Party. Serious people from the Labour Party, like Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers, David Owen, left to form the SDP, and everyone thought that this was the breakthrough, that they were quite moderate, they take votes from the Conservatives and certainly damage Labour in the 1983 general election. Then the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands and everything changed, and the economy began to improve a little bit, and Mrs. Thatcher won, and the SDP eventually merged with the Liberal Democrats. Perhaps we need to go back 100 years during my young reporting days as a journalist, when, of course, the Liberal Party, which had won a huge election in 1906 and was still a massive party in 1910, Lloyd George split with Asquith, and by 1924, 3 general elections in 3 years led to the almost extinction of the Liberal Party by the 1950s and the rise of the Labour Party. So that is what we've got to. And I've been, reading over the weekend. I've been talking to people, and some of them come down on the side that it is a protest vote, that it is a spasm, that Labour can recover if the long-term growth plans and all that start to come through. You've seen that in Labour spokespeople over the weekend trying to say, give us time, it's all going to be all right. And if that happens, then we might look back and reflect on this as being a spasm. The problem is, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, whether that is the case or not, in my opinion, will largely depend on whether this country gets control of its borders. Because I know there are other factors, the charisma of Farage and all that sort of thing. But what is driving this fundamentally, in my opinion, is that spectacle of hundreds of people coming across every day, and then the impact that it has on communities in this country. And it's time for us to cast off any concern about being accused of being racist and things like that. It's not. It's a matter of law. People, genuine refugees, want to come to this country. There are ways of applying, but coming across in rubber boats is not the way forward. And unless that's solved, the Reform UK could go on. I mean, I can talk more about the way in which Reform UK is becoming a more organised party. They're getting better candidates. I thought Sarah Poachin in by-election came over very well, rather better than the Labour candidate. That doesn't count for a great deal, but she looked to me to be a woman who will represent that constituency quite well. So we're beginning to get away from the sort of nutters, the old men that were put up even as soon as the general election. They're beginning to choose their candidates better. So I think this is a serious problem. But I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys say. Spasm or permanent change in our political system?
Andrea Jenkins doesn't really fit the bill in terms of saying ordinary and not nuts, because bloody, I mean, she's the mayor for Lincolnshire, for those who don't know, and you may recall she was the Minister for Education, and they flicked the bird, basically, didn't she, to journalists at one point. I mean, she's absolutely crackers, yeah? So let me just bring Joe in on the conversation. Joe, what are you thinking? Multi-party system here to stay, or just a blip?
Well, I think multi-party system in a sense, because I think the Conservative Party is pretty much destroyed. And there's a really good piece by Justine Greening in The Guardian today, where she talks about, how can you possibly destroy a party with the oldest in the world, the best organised, 200 years old, all of that sort of stuff. And I don't think it matters whether they change leaders. They haven't got any ideas. And I think there will be more people from the Tories moving to Reform at some point. I think the proof of the pudding of whether Reform is here to stay is to see how all these new councillors get on when they are faced with the reality of committee meetings, documents, procedures, the legal ramifications and the legal requirements of what they need to do as councillors. And that I think, much as they might like to go in wielding metaphorical chainsaws and just, carve everything up, I don't know that many of them have any understanding of what is involved and the statutory requirements on county councils, and so on and so forth. So we'll see what happens with that. I mean, they might turn out to be absolutely brilliant and sort things out. But I think what we are seeing is a much more, if you like, geographical fracture. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have now got a swathe across Middle England, really, and parts of the southwest. And it would have been very interesting to see how this would have played out had there been elections in London, Scotland, and Wales. Of course, we've got some of those coming up next year. So I think the parties have all shifted. I think the Liberal Democrats are very clearly presenting themselves as the party of Middle England, and I think they will therefore attract the people who don't like the way the Tories are heading rightward. I was surprised that the Greens didn't do better, actually, and I think Labour, they really need to sort themselves out. But I think Labour will recover. I think the Lib Dems have now recovered from, they were absolutely in the doldrums. Reform may or may not make inroads, but I think in 6 months' time, we will see quite a lot of Reform councillors going, I can't do this and run a business. It's hard work, Frank, you've done it. And it takes a lot of commitment. And there will be people going, you said you're going to change anything and nothing's happened. I've still got a pothole. So, it's the reality of being elected that will be the test. But I do think we are looking at a fracturing. I mean, it was quite a low turnout, around 30%, which is sort of to be expected in local elections, I guess. But we didn't. What we didn't see in this, which we did in the general election, I don't think we saw tactical voting.
No, it was definitely, as you say, Joe, low turnout in areas that don't particularly favour Labour. I think that's worth saying as well. Although that's a bad thing on one hand for the Labour Party, but on the other, they didn't lose as many seats because they didn't have as many to lose. so that's a factor as well. Let me just go to my question, I suppose, that I posed to you guys in terms of whether this is the end of two-party politics. I think that if Labour takes the lesson that Jim suggests, which is this was simply all about immigration and a right-wing agenda, then Labour will be toast come the next election.
Yeah, I agree.
Because actually the issues that were being raised on the doorstep, and this is from Labour activists and indeed has been confirmed by a poll I'm looking at the moment that was carried out by Luke Trill's organisation. It was winter fuel, it was benefit cuts, it was the fact that people are still not feeling better off. It was the economy stupid. And I think that Labour's problem, in a sense, is that they've been dragged to the right, as has Kemi Badenoch, and actually they're never going to win on that particular agenda, because if Labour deported every single immigrant in the country bar 10, Reform would say, why haven't we got rid of those 10? So there is nothing that the Conservatives or Labour can say that is going to be able to compete with Reform's message on immigration, because Reformer always want to go further, and I would suggest to the point of cruelty if you look at what's happening in the United States. So my view is that Labour has got to start to govern, to do stuff, and to stop talking about, well, it's all going to be fine in 4 years' time when we've delivered all of these things, because we do have to take lessons from the States, I think. And you'll recall that what the Democrats and Biden kept saying through his period of office was, we've got to deliver, and when we deliver, it'll be fine. Well, they did deliver, if you look at the numbers. You know, immigration was starting to fall, inflation was starting to fall, the economy was improving, but people had already made their mind up. My fear, and why I think we may be in for a rocky ride in terms of our politics over the next few years, is that people have already made their mind up over Labour and they stopped listening. And it comes back to what we've been saying for months and months now, which is communication. The communication has been poor, and again, from, you know, anecdotal, of course, but people telling me that when they're knocking on doors and saying we've increased the minimum wage, people actually didn't know that. So Labour, I think, at the moment, are in this position of pissing everyone off. You know, so pensioners over winter fuel, farmers over inheritance tax. It's working class based because they don't appreciate what they've done in terms of things like minimum wage, but then they feel under attack on winter fuel and benefits. And then business, because national insurance increases combined with an increase to the minimum wage. So, as I say, they're pissing everybody off. So I think, Jim, that, you know, my pushback on your suggestion that as long as we close the borders, everything will be all right. I agree that immigration is an issue, of course it is. But actually, if they don't start to create this narrative and story of their own, which can't be about immigration because that's not authentic for the Labour Party, it's got to be about improving people's cost of living, improving the economy, growing the economy, and actually start to challenge Reform and Farage on some of these issues, like, so if we send all the immigrants back, what does happen to our National Health Service? If we don't get closer to the European Union, how can we grow our economy? And on your tax and spend plans, where are you going to get all this cash from, Nigel? Because you're saying you're not going to increase tax, and yet you're going to spend all this money on renationalisation of all these different services that you've talked about. So more scrutiny for reform may be a good thing for Labour. But I tell you, if the Tories and the Labour Party take from this election the message that they've got to tack to the right, they are both going to find themselves totally abandoned. Because the final point I'll make, and then I'll bring you back in, Jim, if I may, is that the Greens and the Liberal Democrats took as many, if not more, votes from the Labour Party as reform, and indeed had Green voters voted Labour in that Runcorn by-election, Labour would have won by a few hundred votes. Comes back to your point, Joe. In a general election, would those people have voted tactically? But Labour, Tories can't rely on that. I think they've got to start taking reform on, and they've got to start to carve out their own agenda, make the political weather, and stop Farage being allowed to simply say, well, this is the issue this week, and this is what we've all got to talk about.
Yeah, I wonder whether there wasn't quite a lot of tactical voting, that there was evidence of an attempt to stop Farage, his candidate with Sarah Pochin in Runcorn. I mean, if you look at the figures, obviously neck and neck between Reform and Labour, but the other parties were very, very low indeed. I think there were probably a lot of people who did vote to try and keep Sarah Pochin out. But
do you think, Jim, that from the Tory perspective, though, a lot of Tories voted Reform to keep Labour out?
Yes, quite possibly. I mean, it is. You're quite right to say that Reform are now going to be tested in office, and the most interesting one that's immediately going to come up is the question of illegal immigrants and where they are housed, because, as you know, that is an arrangement between the Home Office and the hotels or the providers. It has nothing to do with local government, although there has been exasperation in local government across all parties about that. But there is going to be a further attempt by Reform to challenge. They think, for instance, that the planning laws are breached, where a hotel is effectively made into a hostel, that could be something that the courts would rule on. So they will, start to be judged on things like that. I mean, also,
they will, Jim, but let me just push you a little bit on what the evidence is telling us, because we agree immigration is an issue, but if we simply start to talk about immigration every week as the big issue, then actually we're ignoring what the voters are telling us here, which is, no, you buggered us about on winter fuel allowance. We don't like what you're doing on disability benefits. We're not sure that you've done the right thing on the economy in terms of your additional national insurance increases, and we don't even know the minimum wage has been increased. Surely if Labour and the Conservatives, for that matter, allow Farage and Reform to focus everybody's attention on immigration, then we are going nowhere fast, Jim, because that will be the only thing that people are thinking about when they go into the polls. And we can't beat Reform on that. None of the parties can.
Okay, I'm probably overreacting because of a sense of exasperation over the weekend that immigration was not raised by the interviewers, by people in my profession, journalists interviewing politicians this weekend. It was hardly mentioned, so maybe I'm overcompensating. I mean, coming on to the economy, of course, there is now a debate going on in the Labour Party. You're quite right, because they've picked up on what you're saying, that people are also concerned about those other issues. And of course, Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, has now weighed in saying, change those fiscal rules, Rachel. You've got to do something about that. And that's going to be an interesting debate. And it goes to something else I wanted to raise, which is, what do we think about the mood in the Labour Party? I mean, on this ridiculous projected national share forecast for the next general election, I think it's 350 Labour MPs would lose their seats. Now, that's unlikely to happen, although I must say, and Frank, you must have been thinking about this over the weekend, your former county councillor of Lancashire, from 0 to 53 Reform councillors. Unbelievable. A lot of Labour MPs are now going to be thinking, the game's up. I mean, quite apart from those in rural areas for whom the farmers will never vote for again. Now, what are they going to do? Are they just going to serve out their 4 years? Or is there going to be more rumblings around Louise Haigh and trying to put pressure on the Chancellor to ease the fiscal restrictions, whereby perhaps there could be modifications on winter fuel allowances and things like that. It's going to be interesting to see what the Parliamentary Labour Party's mood is when they get back.
Yeah, but nobody is saying anything that we haven't said for the last 9 months.
Exactly.
How many times have I said Rachel Reeves has got to get herself out of that straitjacket in terms of the fiscal rules? How many times have we said the communications have got to be better? And how many times have we said Labour doesn't appear to have a narrative, a story, a plan? And they're the issues that after the local elections are no different in a sense. The problems remain the same. It's the solutions that they need to start to come up with. And I think the other thing that I noticed over the weekend, I'd like to get your opinion on this, Joe, is that some of the people that I would have thought would be real stars in terms of this government started well. And in terms of their own brief, I'm talking about West Streeting, for example, in this context, have done a good job. But they appear to be becoming more autocratic and robotic in every television appearance. So the authenticity has gone. And it seems to me that, I don't know whether this is instruction from Morgan McSweeney in Number 10, whether it's something from head office, whether it's Keir Starmer's doctrine. But it appears to me that they're all in this box.
Yeah.
If you've got these 3 or 4 messages, and Laura Koonsberg, who, as Jim and you know, Joe, I absolutely love, but she quite rightly, she had Bridget Phillipson on first in the election programme on Thursday evening. I watch these things, we watch these things, listeners, so that you don't have to. But it was, midnight, and Bridget Phillipson's doing her very best to defend the situation. And as Jim said, she's saying, we need more time. The phrase she kept using was, we've got to go further and faster. They then had some other minister on. Can't remember her name. I do apologise. And the first thing
Emma
she said
Reynolds.
was, that's the one. And the first thing she said, Jim, wasn't it? We've got to go further and faster. And rightly so. Laura Koonsberg said, oh, hang on. We've just had Bridget Phillipson on, said that 6 or 7 times. Is that the line of the night? Yeah. And subsequently, she really struggled because she put that phrase away and she was trying to think of other words. But that lack of authenticity, that lack of having an ability, because if you've not got the charismatic leader, which Keir Starmer clearly isn't, Rachel Reeves ain't that good either in terms of projecting messages, you've then got to allow your team to put those messages across. Yeah, and I think those good communicators, Joe, again, I'll use the word, have been put in a bit of a straitjacket.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I listened to Wes Streeting over the weekend and during the election results, and he's turned into a robot. Yeah. I mean, he's slightly better than some of them, but yeah, they have a phrase. This is this week's phrase, and it's absolute meaningless garbage. It's like mission. And Ed Miliband, I'm afraid, is the worst communicator of all. On something that should be so important about climate change and stuff, but he just comes across as a raving nutcase, which turns people off. So it's easy for Reform and the like of the sort of anti-green campaigners to go, oh, well, we don't want solar panels. They're going to do this and that and, ruin the cost of your houses and all of that stuff. So I think you're absolutely right, Frank. And I think, the one person who is authentic, Angela Rayner, where is she?
Where is she? Yeah.
I mean, she hasn't been out. She hasn't done any interviews. And she is the one person who connects with people. And I absolutely, just to go back to the immigration thing, I completely agree with you, Frank. I don't think, Reform have made immigration the issue. But the real issue for people is they are just fed up. They're tired. They're hard up. And you look at so many towns in this country where it's boarded up shops or vape shops or nail bars. It doesn't matter if the minimum wage has gone up. If you can't get a job, it doesn't make any difference. And so you've got this feeling of emptiness, metaphorically and literally, of once thriving communities. And you've spoken about it in the past, Frank, about, where you grew up. But you just sort of think, well, actually, what you need is, where was Keir Starmer? He didn't even go to Runcorn.
No. And
again, Frank, are you two in favour of easing the fiscal rules? Because that would be one way of helping. But what's the market reaction going to be?
Well, I think you've got to start to give us a clue, haven't you, in terms of what this journey with Labour is going to be like over the next 4 years? And if it's more austerity, and I know they don't like that word and they deny that's what they're pursuing, but that's what we're heading for.
Yeah.
If she stays within the spending plans that she set herself. Now, if you look at what Germany have done, okay, they're in a much more healthy financial position than we are in terms of their overall borrowings. But there are countries out there, the United States being one of them, of course, that are way above the 100% of GDP borrow ratio. So it's doable. You've got to be careful, of course you have. But given the fact that we've got infrastructure spend required for defence and security, given the fact that she's got the lever to pull on the European Union and a closer relationship, and I understand that's complex and complicated, but I think you've got to go for gold with that. And given that people in this country, at least, do actually find Donald Trump really distasteful and still support Ukraine, there's enough things in your armoury to attack reform and attack the right. But if you simply say, OK, what's the Daily Mail's campaign this week and Nigel Farage's message this week, and how can we get onto that territory and beat him? Well, you're in for a hiding. You're not going to be able to do that. So she's got to find a way, the government have got to find a way of getting some extra cash into the Treasury, getting that spending out of the door, as Joe said, making people feel as though there is a difference being made to their lives. And again, you see, we're remembering that it's okay saying it's 14 years we're trying to keep. It was 18 years that Tony Blair inherited of a Conservative government. They didn't turn things around overnight, but everybody had a sense that there was a plan, there was optimism, and there was a good
just to come back on it, just to come back on the spending thing, on the markets, you haven't answered it. I mean, obviously she fears that there would be here goes Labour, we'll start to run the markets, not necessarily on the trust scale, but if they did that, then Labour really would be in problems. I mean, I imagine that's what she fears.
Yes, but Jim, you've got businesses across the country who are so hidebound, hamstrung, if you like, because of the lack of certainty, because of the lack of confidence, because of the increases. And, I go back to this sort of, you see it in our high streets, hairdressers closing because they can't afford the rates and the rents, and they can't afford the extra national insurance. So they're now working from home on their own. Pubs are closing. There are so many places, and you could go to any town in the country and you will find charity shops, vape shops, nail bars, because people can't afford to run those small businesses. And I think, what Labour should have done, and I know we've said this before, you're going to cut winter fuel, fine, but say at the same time, but we're going to do Sure Start. That's what Tony Blair did within weeks. And it was life-changing for so many families and saved a fortune on so much. They have done nothing that anybody can feel any benefit from. So, to go faster and whatever the phrase is, and further, doing what? And I think people are really fed up. And I think, Rachel Reeves has got this opportunity, as we've said before. Everything's changed. Trump, Ukraine, etc., etc. She has got the window, and it's closing quite quickly, to say, right, everything's changed, so I'm changing too. And she needs to put in some tax on high earners and wealth. I mean, if we're going to row back on, the tech firms in order to cozy up to Trump, well, what message does that send to a bloke who's running a painting and decorating business?
I think that's the alternative, Jim, isn't it? So I think you could do two things, combination of additional borrowings, but not to the extent that the markets are going to be spooked. But you can get away with, as we said before, spending on big infrastructure and capital projects. That doesn't solve your problem in a sense, because councils, for example, will tell you it's revenue that they need, not necessarily capital. So I get where you're coming from, and I understand it's not simple. And you can't simply say, well, just start borrowing more money, Rachel, everything will be fine. But the other straitjacket she's put herself in, as you know, Jim, is we're not going to increase national insurance. We're not going to increase income tax. We're not going to. Well, they keep saying to us, and I said this to Darren Jones when I met him a couple of weeks ago, the world has changed. Well, if the world has changed, then surely the sensible thing is for you to change too. So there is an opportunity, but it's just, Joe's just said it, it's a very, very small window of opportunity where they could come out and make the statement to say, we've got to do something radical here because we are in a totally different geopolitical world than when we were elected last July. Trump and his tariffs, the turmoil that's still occurring in Europe, we've still got the conflict. I haven't even talked about the impact this had on Labour in Palestine, Israel, Gaza Strip, all of that stuff. So, yeah, big challenges, Jim. But I think if we simply say, well, we're going to stick to the spending that we've got, we're going to carry out austerity, we're going to try and make things a little bit better, then that's fine. But in 4 years' time, Labour are not going to be re-elected.
Well, it's very interesting. I just think that I know you want to break out of the straitjacket. Joe seems to favour wealth tax, which they might get away with. Frank, you seem to almost suggest that perhaps she should look at income tax. It would be a hell of a gamble because the Tories would just roar away with that.
But Jim, she could raise the personal threshold. So there needs to be some rebalancing. And what we've got is this absolute increase in lack of social mobility. And that should never happen under a Labour government. So actually, if you raise the personal threshold at the very bottom, which has not changed in years, because if you're on the minimum wage or you're getting increased pensions or other benefits, you're now quite likely being tipped into having to pay tax at the same time that all the bills are going up. So
but she needs that money because the things are so tight.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, but where do you get the money from, Jim?
But you can't keep milking a bull, as a bank manager once said to me when I tried to borrow some money. You can't keep hitting the people at the bottom because there is nothing left. There are things that the government has got control over and can be stricter and tougher on, like, standing charges for electricity and gas, for instance, which hit the poorest people the hardest. They're paying £1 a day, whether or not they're using any fuel, and they're saving money because they can't afford the fuel bills. Water bills have gone up. What has the government done? Oh, well, we might send them to prison. Well, how long is that going to take? They're not doing anything that makes anybody feel any better. And she needs to do that because that's the way you get people spending money, taking more staff on, and that in turn helps boost the economy.
As I say, I think they have done things, Joe. The problem is that people don't feel it.
People don't know it, and they don't see it.
People don't know it. But I think that that one thing that I mentioned, minimum wage, we mentioned last week, breakfast clubs, these are all practical measures that are being taken that will help, but they take time. But in the absence of that story that we keep saying they need, then people aren't going to get that, are they? They're going to go, well, that's not enough.
No,
but
exactly.
Actually, if you know where the end game is, then people would say, okay, that's the first few steps on a journey which is going to end here, and that's what I think they haven't got. But Jim's point is valid, because I think that Liz Truss, Brexit, the financial crash, all of these things loom large still in the minds of people who are having to make decisions, tough decisions, that Rachel Reeves is having to make. And we can be very flippant sat here and say, well, get rid of your fiscal rules and all the rest of it. You have to do it carefully, Jim. But the point I would make is that you cannot continue to do what you're doing now and expect to still be in government in 4 years' time. So if it's not change your fiscal rules, if it's not increase taxes, then they're going to have to come up with, dare I use this phrase, James, a third way, because you simply cannot, as I say, expect to stay in government if people are as dissatisfied with what is at this moment in time a very, what I've described as plodding along the government and not taking control of the agenda. I think that's the other big thing here, isn't it? We don't appear to have a government that is in control. We seem to have a government that is reacting. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think they are to some extent. I mean, there are some important things coming up. I mean, the government needs to gain credibility. It needs to gain wins, and it's desperate for this trade deal with the United States. But I just don't. I mean, look at today's development. Trump's going to put 100% tariff on films.
Yeah.
I mean, the UK, he's fed up because Star Wars and things is made here. And it's a huge contributor to the British economy. How you can work out a trade treaty with a man who's doing that, I don't know. But I bring more bad news from the European Union.
Yeah.
Apparently, they are refusing to hand over and share criminal records. This is to try and help us with the refugee problem. They're saying we can't do it because you're not a member of the European Union. Now, there may well be valid reasons for that. And as a hardline Remainer, there's a bit of me which irresponsibly takes some satisfaction from that on the basis if you're not in a club, you don't get the benefits. And that's what people should have realised when they voted in 2016. But on a pragmatic basis, it's a very hard line because it's surely in the interests of everyone in the EU or not to exchange this information. I only make that point to say this, that I'm not holding my breath for what's actually going to happen with this EU negotiation. And if he fails to get an American treaty, fails to get an EU treaty, it's all going to pile in behind what you're saying, that they're just carrying on reacting to things and not doing anything about it.
And I just wish that he would actually stop shilly-shallying around and say, our future lies with Europe. We've got a special relationship, but we need to be with our... And the people who will say, oh, that's betrayal of the referendum vote. Well, they're probably going to vote reform anyway. So frankly, who cares? Actually come out, be pro-European, nail your colours to the mast, make it clear that, all this sucking up to Trump is hopeless because he'll change his mind tomorrow.
Well, and that's where I see a real thing for the Liberal Democrats. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize this, and I'm sure Frank will say this is completely over the top. But, the Lib Dems are clear on that issue. And, if Labour is going to collapse, it is a political opportunity for the Liberal Democrats. And, I mean, without being fanciful, if Labour and the Tories really are on the descent, the general election of 2029 could well be between Reform UK and a really robust Liberal Democrat Party, which will gather in all those people with social values, environmental values, and a strong stance on Europe. And that might be how it plays out, but I know that's a bit fanciful.
Highly unlikely, but we'll see. I mean, we live in interesting times, as they say. Just let me turn to the American question for a second. I don't want to talk about Trump because we've done it to death in a sense over the past couple of weeks. But overnight, British forces were involved in a bombing exercise with the United States on the Houthis. These are the sort of things that Britain are still supporting the States with, despite all of the crap that we're having to take from President Trump. And we'll talk later about Canada and Australia and the fact that you've got two people there who've won elections on an anti-Trump ticket. Again, if you think about how you can start to push back against Farage and his agenda, it is his closeness to the Trump White House. It is his attitude towards Putin and Ukraine. But at the moment, Starmer can't play that card because he's so concerned about what Donald Trump's going to say. I'm with you, Jim. I think it's for the birds, this trade deal with America.
It's ridiculous.
The Tories have been trying to negotiate it for 9 years. And that was under a, dare I say it, more stable administration. Even if he signed a deal with us tomorrow, he couldn't guarantee that 2 weeks Friday it was still going to be in place. So this relationship with Europe is crucial. The other thing I'd say, and I'll bring you back in then, Joe, over May, is that the Europeans will have been watching those elections carefully. And again, I'm told over the weekend that there are, particularly from Germany, an awful lot of people saying we've got to give the Brits an opportunity, of getting as much done as they can. Bake it in. Okay, try and get to the point where this is really enabling our economy to grow, and of course helping Europe as well. But let's do what we can to secure for a Labour government a decent deal so they can stop the far right from advancing. Now, you do have countries in the EU, as you say, Jim, who, probably France among them, to be fair, are sceptical because they don't think that Brexit should be rewarded in any way, shape or form. But I think that the sensible voices in Europe, Joe, are saying this is an opportunity. But we've got to meet them halfway. And meeting them halfway is, as you say, our government being clear. Now, our future is actually going to be with the European Union. Of course, we want to stay friends with America, but in terms of trade and our economic growth, then Europe is the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as I say, Keir Starmer doesn't need to be frightened anymore, because the people who are, you know, fierce Brexiteers they're not going to change their minds, even though, you know, they know perfectly well that the increase in bureaucracy and red tape has crippled so many businesses. And the, you know, the inability to get stuff is crippling so many businesses. So, yeah, and I think, you know, we have seen a more pragmatic Europe. There does seem to be a reasonable relationship, even though that, you know, politically they're far apart, between Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Macron and other members. And you just think, come on, Keir, stop it. Stop trying to suck up. And I think people actually find it quite repugnant, because I think Trump is a laughing stock. Unfortunately, he's very dangerous. But I think most people in this country really find him distasteful. And the way the media fawn over every time he, you know, opens his mouth, and the way Keir Starmer has tried to play it. No, actually, we need to work with Europe, and he needs to come out and say that. And I think there would be a collective sigh of relief.
One last word on Europe. I mean, I listened to what Frank's saying, the Germans saying, give the Brits a break. What worries me about the growth of reform is there'll be other people in Europe saying, whilst there's any prospect of reform being part of the next British government, and until it's the settled will of the British people on all sides to be involved with European affairs, there's no point in negotiating. But it's going to be interesting how it plays out.
Well, I'm sure that some people are saying that, Jim, but that would be a stupid approach, because what the European Union should be doing is saying, let's get trade deals in place that benefit all, and then whoever comes into government in 4 years' time can't untangle that, because that would damage their economy. So that is the alternative argument. But of course, unless you really push him from the Brit side to say those things, and as I say, making it clear that you see your future as an ally, a closer ally to Europe than this nonsensical fantasy that we have about being this close partner and this special relationship with America, which, as we've rehearsed previously, has never really been the case anyway, then it's not going to be easy to do. I'm told that in May there is going to be a defence and security agreement between the EU and the UK. And then in November, there'll be a second phase to those announcements, because the trade deal Johnson did, which was appalling, is up for renewal. And that's when we might start to see some light at the end of the tunnel as far as those negotiations are concerned. But as we've all said, time is of the essence here. Labour's got to start to spell out what the journey is. And for me, part of that story needs to be a much closer, pragmatic relationship with our closest trading partner. We will see. We haven't even had a chance to talk about the issues of Palestine and Israel, and how 8 independents were elected in Lancashire as well. So we talked, Jim, about reforms, big increase in vote in Lancashire, but in East Lancashire, you know, an awful lot of the pro-Palestinian councillors now were elected because of people's displeasure with Labour's stance on that issue as well. So a whole myriad of problems facing the Labour Party that we can't cover in one podcast, but I'm sure we'll come back to those issues in future broadcasts. Final word, if I may, Skelmersdale, which was the town I represented for many years, and it's a great place. I mean, the people are absolutely lovely, but it's a place that has been left to rack and ruin, and inevitably, and it's been coming as this, people have said in Skem, we're bloody fed up. We've had Labour rule here forever, and we've still not got our train station. Our health service is going to pot. Can't get a GP appointment. You've closed our high schools. There is nothing left in that town. And again, I think looking at the selection of candidates sometimes for parliamentary seats, people are wondering whether they're being listened to, whether they've got MPs that really represent them locally at a constituency level, or if people are just being parachuted in and then they spend most of the time in Westminster. And that issue is something that is going to affect towns right across the country. And, you know, Skelmersdale, voting reform, just unimaginable to me. But 3 councillors there, and all good councillors, by the way, defeated because, as I say, people are just totally disaffected, disillusioned with the Labour Party. So Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and co, you've got a big job to do. You've got to turn it round, and you've got to turn it round quickly. The second part of the programme, I think we're going to do a 3-parter today. We're going to look at what the Conservatives take away from this, and we should just have a word about Nigel Farage and reform as well. So stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to this very special bank holiday podcast in our downtown den with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. So we've talked about the Labour Party in the first part of the programme. We could have gone on. We didn't touch on the reshuffle, for example, that has been rumoured to be happening shortly, but we can perhaps come back to that next week. I do want to ask about what this means for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party, because if it was a bad night for Labour, it was a catastrophic night for the Tories. And perhaps on the back of the general election, where they saw their parliamentary grouping go down to just over 100, we are witnessing the death throes of the most successful democratic political party in the history of democracy. Joe, is that a stretch, or actually could we be seeing the beginnings, as Jim mentioned at the start of this podcast today, and the way that the Liberal Party were replaced by Labour, the Tories being replaced by Reform?
Yes, I think the Tories are in their death throes, and I think it's been a long and agonising death. You know, so many different leaders and nothing changes. I mean, Kemi Badenoch is useless. And I know that many people within the Conservative Party in Parliament and outside of Parliament are absolutely fed up with her. But, you know, if they change leaders now, for what? They don't know what they stand for anymore. And you've got people like Robert Jenrick, who desperately wants to be leader. We know Suella Braverman is very likely to follow her husband into the welcoming arms of reform. Would Jenrick then go into some sort of coalition deal with Nigel Farage? Well, then you've got 2 male egos fighting like rats in a sack. I think the Tory party will fracture. And I think, you know, the Tory party of William Hague and Michael Heseltine and John Major, you know, Damien Green, those sort of people, they may find a home with the Liberal Democrats, or they may try and take over as the right of the Tory party eventually go to reform. But I think it's a great shame. I mean, the only thing I would say is I think voting is so important, and a healthy democracy needs lots of parties. So much as I loathe reform and everything they stand for, and the lies they peddle, and the way they've campaigned, and the way they get a free ride on the media, as we've discussed often. If their presence has invigorated people who otherwise had given up on the other political parties, then I think that is quite a good thing. What we need to do now is to have a sensible debate, but you're not going to get that with the current state of British media. And that, I think, is the problem. And I think, the Tories are caught in that, because what do they stand for? Absolutely nothing. And so many of the problems, whether it's immigration, whether it's broken infrastructure, whether it's debt, whether it's, cronyism, that was their fault and they did nothing about it. But that's not a way for Labour to win the argument. I think the Tories pretty much need to go and lie down in a darkened room and work out what they want to be and what they want to represent.
I think that you're right, that it's not the answer for Labour in terms of simply pointing and saying 14 years, but that narrative isn't working for the government. But nonetheless, you're right equally to say people do blame the Conservatives still for the mess that the country finds itself in. Conservative said to me over the weekend that Kemi Badenoch is absolutely all over the place. Performances at PMQs are poor. Not said that she's out and about enough, pressing the flesh, meeting party members, getting out and campaigning. But the other point that she made to me, which I thought was quite interesting, is you can't stand up at the dispatch box every week and challenge Keir Starmer to say what you're going to do about whatever the issue is that particular week. And then when asked, what are your policies, say, well, I've got to be given time.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a total contradiction in terms of this approach. Now, it's again, we talk about it being a challenge for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in terms of their inheritance. We've got to accept that it was a hell of a challenge for Badenoch to take up, but she's taking it. And Jim, I don't think she's making a great fist of it. But if Jenrick is the answer, I don't know what the question is, because to me, it just seems like a bloody, a rich bloke's bloody Alan Partridge. Jenrick, it doesn't seem credible to me. And I think Farage would eat him for breakfast. So what is the future for the Conservatives, do you think?
Well, it may be. I mean, this is quite complicated. It's what happens, because I do think Jenrick will become leader. I think Kemi Badenoch has got temporary leader written all over her. And if it hadn't been for the huge turnover in Tory leaders over the last few years, there would be moves to remove her immediately after these disastrous local elections. It's just that they just cannot contemplate the pantomime of what would it be, the 7th leader in 10 years or something. And that's what's holding them back. But Jenrick's clearly on manoeuvres. And, next year's elections aren't in such promising Conservative territory. So I think, in about a year's time, he will become leader of the party. Then, what would his relationship be with Nigel Farage? And meanwhile, the One Nation Conservatives, the Damien Green sort of David Gauke type Conservatives, are going to feel fairly homeless. Now, Joe poses a very interesting possibility that, as Jenrick takes his troops into some sort of coalition, an eventual, a bit like the National Liberals, if that won't mean anything to anyone except me who was covering the National Liberals in the 1930s and 40s, but eventually they become part of the Conservative Party, and they become part of Reform. And the One Nation Conservatives form a embryonic party, and maybe those sort of socially liberal, pro-European, but low tax sort of conservative values, that's what they used to believe in, a nascent party could come. Or they are attracted to the Liberal Democrats, but that would require the Liberal Democrats to change a bit as well, because I think immigration's a weak issue for the Lib Dems. So, all this is if buts and maybes.
I mean, the Conservative Party have been written off before.
Yes.
And they do find a way of coming back. So may I suggest the way back with 2 words: Boris Johnson.
No.
You don't think so, Joe?
No.
You see, I think Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage used this wonderful phrase over the victory at Runcorn. He has got this great way of coming up with a soundbite, hasn't he? We won by a gnat's knob. A gnat's knob. No one else could get away with saying that other than Nigel Farage. I would suggest that the British electorate have the memory of a gnat these days. So we would say Boris Johnson, Partygate and the chaos and the blah, blah, blah. I tell you, every poll will say that of all the Conservatives that you name, who is the most popular? It's Boris Johnson still. And I think if they brought him back, he is probably one of the personalities, in fact, the only one that I can see across the Conservative Party who could take Farage on.
I think people, including many Conservative members or Conservative supporters, have not forgiven him, not just for Partygate, but actually for failing to negotiate any deal on Brexit, because it was quite clear that there was no plan, for totally screwing up and putting the Good Friday Agreement at risk, for lying, cheating, lying to the Queen, all of those things. I don't think people have forgiven him, and I think he is largely responsible for the demise of the Conservative Party. I mean, it would be interesting to see, had James Cleverly, how they can screw up their own bungled attempt to get him into position of leader. It beggars belief that they should even be thinking of running the country again. But, had James Cleverly won the leadership election, he would have been a much better opponent, certainly in the Commons, against Keir Starmer, or Jim's favourite, Mel Stride. I think they
would. But the problem is, Joe, I think that they would have been a better opposition leader, but they wouldn't have cut through with the electorate.
No, but
and the problem with Kemi Badenoch isn't simply she doesn't perform in Parliament. She doesn't cut through with the electorate. Doesn't much matter whether they perform in Parliament.
Well,
people out there don't watch Prime Minister's questions like we do.
No, but I think, given that the government has been so inept on so many levels, as we've discussed often on this podcast, it would have been quite easy for a more competent leader of the opposition to land some blows, which I think then would have reinvigorated a bit of hope within the Conservative Party. There would have been a little bit of unity, and it would have been, Labour have got away with quite a lot of appalling decisions and appalling performances because Kemi Badenoch's so weak. Whereas if you had got a better leader of the opposition, then I think, they'd have been having an even rougher time.
I'm not sure about that. I think that if you are serious about the Conservative Party surviving without having to go into some sort of reverse takeover, is what I could see this being. Because Farage, rightly, is saying at the moment, why would we do a deal with the Conservatives? The Conservatives is a toxic brand with a poor leadership, a poor ground. They've got nobody on the ground. Their ground troops were basically all fucked on Thursday.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party now, in terms of its activist base, is made up of councillors, and most of them in counties, and they were just battered on Thursday. So, given their survival instincts, honestly, I think Boris Johnson, if he wants it, could come back and take the leadership again. And I do think he'd give Farage more a run for his money than certainly Jenrick or Badenoch could. Jim, you look sceptical as well.
No,
I'm the only one who thinks this.
No. I mean, desperate. On the basis that desperate times require desperate measures. I agree with everything Joe says about how soiled the brand of Johnson is. All that past history and so on. But if we are, and I deprecate it in some ways, there are some qualities of Sir Keir Starmer that I actually admire. His calmness
Yeah.
You can call it, you've got alternative words for everything. Calmness is dullness, and indecision is thinking about things. You can ascribe all sorts of adjectives, and I prefer that sort of political leader to this sort of age of celebrity. But if we are in that, Frank has a point that who on earth could take him on? But I just don't know what I mean. I'm just thinking. I was just thinking that a Tory leadership election featuring Johnson, Jenrick, and either Cleverly or Mel Stride. What would the Tories actually vote for? It'd be an interesting question.
Johnson would walk it. Johnson will walk it. So again, take off your gut instinct anti-Johnson feelings, which the three of us have. And if you're a tribal conservative who is desperate to see your party survive and have half a chance of winning the next election, of those three candidates or four candidates you've just mentioned, James, there is only one of them who stands a chance of a conservative recovery, and that is Boris Johnson.
But first of all, you'd have to win a by-election.
You win a by-election, won't they? Pick a seat
against reform.
They are great at this sort of stuff, aren't they? The Tories are great at this sort of stuff. If they are serious about wanting to survive as an independent party without, as I say, being taken over by reform, which is where we'd be at this moment in time, is there another character out there? You both said, well, Jenrick is a shoo-in for the leadership. Well, do either of you then, let me reverse the question, think that Robert Jenrick can save the Conservative Party?
No.
Well, I mean, on a sort of project to sort of try and unite the right, and offer some sort of...
That's not the question. I could do that. I could take the Conservative Party over, bend over and say, oh, Nigel, take me now. Anyone could do that, which is where Jenrick would be. What I'm saying to you is, if you were a tribal conservative who wanted to see your party have half a chance of surviving and competing as the main opposition at the next general election, would Robert Jenrick be the man to do that?
Possibly not, because of the alienation of the One Nation Conservatives within my party. I would see him as a divisive figure that is going to see half the party go off to the Liberal Democrats, or else make a new party altogether.
And Boris Johnson would be a better bet. And yes, so Boris Johnson, for me, is the only hope that the Conservatives have. And I tell you this, as somebody who can't abide Boris Johnson, who would you rather see in number 10? Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage?
Choice. I mean,
total silence. We haven't got off air, people. I'm just looking at two people here who've just been asked the impossible question.
It's such a horrible choice.
Let me revert to Jenrick again and say that maybe if he doesn't do it, if he says that I'm going to be strong on immigration and I am going to take all the tough lines that reform would do, but I also bring to it the tradition of a Conservative Party, low tax, things like that. He might. It just depends how extreme he would be. I mean, I just think Johnson's got so much baggage.
Do you know what?
I think the other thing to bear in mind is that most of the Conservative membership is now in its 60s, 70s, and they are very, very low base. They haven't got the ground troops that they used to have to organise election campaigns, to organise leafleting and canvassing. So I think a lot of those older people actually really loathe Boris Johnson for the way he treated the country and the way he behaved.
You're wrong, Joe. I think you're wrong.
Well, we'll see. I think Mel Stride might come through. I think Jim might. And he might be a winner.
Or he might give up his seat for Boris Johnson for the Brian.
Bloody hell, can I get a word in?
Sorry.
But me, honestly, I know it's bank holiday, but come on. I've just realised why right-wing journalists love posing awkward questions to liberals and progressives like you two. Because you both know that Boris Johnson will be a much better bet for the Conservatives in terms of the wider electorate. And you both know that we would all, through gritted teeth, much prefer Boris Johnson in number 10 than Nigel Farage, because Boris Johnson is not as extreme right as Nigel Farage. Indeed, in my view, in reality, Boris Johnson was pro-Europe. He's always been very liberal. Look at his record when he was London Mayor on social issues. And I can't see Boris Johnson saying, put immigrants in tents and start shooting the buggers as they land on the shores of Dover. So, you know, Boris Johnson for me would be a much better bet for the Conservatives. But there you go. We will wait and see. It's not our fight in a sense. Although I did say right after the general election, if you recall, that the worst thing for the Labour Party, the Labour government, would be for the Conservatives to collapse. And I think that's been borne out in a sense. Right, reform then, and Nigel Farage. We've already touched on the fact that they are not the most experienced of political operators, so some of the machinations within local government may bite them on the arse. Would point out many of those local authorities they've taken over are due to be abolished in 12 months' time as mayors and combined authorities with local government reorganisation comes into play in places like Cheshire and Lancashire, for example. But they will try and use the new platform that they have to embarrass the government. And Jim's already referenced this earlier. One of the things that they could do is take court cases against the government and the Home Office where they are using hotels in their localities to house refugees, asylum seekers. That's just one thing that they could do that I think will grab headlines and would be a smart political move for them. Whether or not they've got the resources to take on these big legal challenges is besides the point in a sense, because if I was Reform, I wouldn't be too much bothered as to whether it got to court, but just the fact that you're waving that flag and making those noises could be enough. And the other point I'll make, I'll come to you on this, Joe, if I may, is, aren't they right? Isn't it absolutely nonsensical for us to be spending absolute fortunes on basically putting money in the pockets of already fairly wealthy hoteliers?
Oh, yeah, completely. But, you know, when we left the European Union, we lost the ability to return migrants. We have, as Jim alluded to at the beginning, we lost the access to data which would have given us immediate information in real time about convicted criminals and a fingerprint database, which would have speeded up the whole deportation process. And 14 years of the Tories, who saw immigration, both legal and illegal, rise through the roof, and no plan or anything to deal with it. So yes, of course, Reform have got many things where they can shoot craps, if you like, and say, well, we're going to do this, or we're going to do that, we're going to do the other. But I think they will come unstuck on things like taxi services provided by councils for kids who need to go to special schools. Costs an absolute fortune. In rural areas, there is no alternative. You know, you start looking at that cost and you think, we're going to cut that, or we're going to cut care facilities, or we're going to cut libraries, or we're going to cut sports centres, or, you know, all of those things. Never mind, you know, they might save a few £1,000 on getting rid of an equalities officer or something like that. And I think they will come unstuck. I think, as I said earlier, I think they'll find it hard. I think what's interesting to me is, how will Nigel Farage deal with this? Because as somebody wrote in one of the papers over the weekend, everything he's done before, he's walked away from as soon as he's achieved his aim. You know, straight after the referendum, he resigned. Now, if he wants to get into number 10, he's got to stick with this for the next 4 years. And as inevitably there will be problems, there will be ructions, there will be infighting, there will be some defections and resignations. It's not so easy. And there will be councillors doing interviews on local television and in local papers and things who might cause Reform a headache. And of course, that's not exclusive to Reform. But I wonder whether, in his heart of hearts, he's done an amazing job. He's run a fantastic campaign full of energy and, charisma and all the rest of it, and met millions of people. But now it's 4 years of hard slog and the reality, so people can see what reform in power really means. And I think there might be a part of him that thinks, I can't walk away from this one.
How old is he, Joe?
He's just turned 60, 61
okay,
maybe.
So he's relatively young in political terms, isn't he? He's not of the Trumpian age or the Jim Hancock age. So Jim, what what are you making of reform? And again, you cannot ignore the fact that this moment in time largely a one-man band. I know they're starting to get new voices emerging now, but it does strike me he has a great turn of phrase. He wins that election, as I say, in Runcorn, and it's by a gnat's knob. He then goes to Durham and says, if you work from home, if you're in DAI departments, if you're working on the net zero agenda, start looking for a new job. All of these things resonate with his base. I'm not sure it's as effective as what Trump does in the States. I don't think it has that sort of widespread support. But of course, as we found last July at the general election, you don't need widespread support. You need about 33% of the electorate. And the key thing, of course, for reform this time around, who've often bemoaned the first past the post system, was that it benefited this time because they did break through that 30% barrier.
Yeah. I think, obviously the huge issue facing local government is social care and children's services, which absorb 80% of the budget. And, whilst Joe has mentioned one area where they might try and tinker around the edges with taxis in rural areas, well, that would be very unwise. I have no idea what the Reform Party feels about the future of local government finance. I mean, do they favour accelerating the inquiry into social care? Because if the care of the elderly could be taken off the backs of local government, that would transform it, in my opinion. I mean, obviously, we'd have to pay through another route, but that I have no idea. That is the major issue facing local government. But they're fixated on these diversity officers, of which there are none in one or two of the authorities that they've taken over. That's small stuff. But some of them are popular. I mean, I have no idea whether Lancashire ordered 100 ergonomic, expensive chairs for their councillors or whatever. But, things like that, if that is still going on, given the state of local government, then they can pick those out and they can be temporarily popular. But working from home, again, people say things aren't working in this country and they get poor services. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons for that is that people are working from home. They can't just lean across the office and say to somebody else, look, Mr. McKenna's got a problem here with his leaks and so on. What do we do about it? So that sort of thing, ending that, I have no idea. I think there'll be a more vigorous response by the local government unions in this country than there are in the United States, where over 100,000 civil servants have been sacked. But it is going to be interesting because, it depends how much publicity is given to it. I thought Farage was quite clever in another respect, where he said, the press is going to scrutinise local government far better than they have done over the last few years, because they'll be scrutinising us. So maybe we'll see. But the last thing is, of course, that he does struggle with tall poppies, and Andrea Jenkins ain't going to be quiet in her new role as mayor. And we see how Ben Houchin and Andy Burnham have become national figures. And if Andrea becomes a national figure, how's he going to react to that? Is he going to be a team player? I doubt it.
I did describe on the evening that was the worst result for Nigel Farage on the night, and Andrea Jenkins' election. I stand by that. And you mentioned Andy Burnham there, and we were talking about authentic Labour voices earlier. And again, do Labour need to start to use people like Andy Burnham? Because they seem to me to be more of an antidote to Farage and his style of politics than Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves. But you will tell me, Jim, and you will be right, that he's not flavour of the month in Downing Street, so it's unlikely to happen. Anyway, listen, I think we could talk a lot more about the local elections, the fallouts, and we will come back to some of these issues next week. But I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to touch on what's been happening abroad as well. So I'm going to take another very short break, and when we come back, we're going to do Canada, Australia, and Romania. Stick with us. Honestly, we won't be long. Welcome back to part 3 of this bonanza of a Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. We've talked about the UK elections. We're going to turn our attention to what's been happening abroad, and in Canada and Australia, progressives have prevailed despite having some real turmoil in recent years, and it seemed a few months ago that the Conservatives, or the equivalent of Conservative parties, would be elected in both of those countries. Talk about the reason why that didn't happen in a moment. But in Romania, the first round of their election contest has gone to a sort of mini Trumpian. So it's not all good news as far as us progressives are concerned. But let's start with Canada and Australia, because I think we've got an outcome there for the same reason, in a sense, which is Donald Trump. I'm delighted to see an Evertonian has become Prime Minister of Canada in Mark Carney, and Albanese has won in Australia. This despite the fact that just a few months ago, in each of those countries, the Conservatives were running 20-25 points ahead in the polls. And as I say, it's Donald Trump that is done for the Tories, or the Conservatives, the Liberals, actually, as they're called in Australia. So, Jim, are the lessons for Keir Starmer and co in this country on the basis of Carney and Albo winning those elections?
Yes, well, it was elbows up, wasn't it, in Canada? And, you know, I mean, countries will not have other countries, albeit allies and friends, bullying them and patronising them. And so Donald Trump has manifestly failed in those two respects, both in Canada and in Australia. You obviously, you know, this is continuing your theme that you're concerned about this desperate attempt by Starmer to be loved by Trump, and he'd be better advised to be taking a more robust line. But I don't think Starmer's convinced about that yet. Ed Davey clearly is taking that line and maybe benefited with some votes from that. I do think there are lessons in that if you're seen to be too craven in the face of someone like Donald Trump, that people don't approve of it. I mean, the government's argument is it's all very well taking stands like Ed Davey is, but they're running the country and they're trying to do the best in terms of a trade deal and that sort of thing. But you know, clearly the Carney stance in Canada and Albanese in Australia, to a slightly lesser extent, have clearly paid off.
Joe, do you think that Keir could learn some lessons, or do you think that those two countries are so far away that it doesn't really apply to the UK?
Well, I think it does apply to the UK. And as I said earlier on, I think, you know, Keir Starmer needs to come out and say loud and clearly, you know, we want to keep our close friendship with the Americans, and we are working with them, you know, on military activities and other things, but our future lies with Europe. Thank you very much, and move on. I think you can't ride two horses. I know he's tried very hard, but Trump is totally unpredictable and totally untrustworthy. And I think it's brilliant because it does show people that actually you can turn things around. You just need, you know, I think Mark Carney is probably a really good bloke to do this, and he's obviously well experienced in many things, not just banking, and he will be a good figurehead. I'm more surprised in a way about Australia, because it is so far away from America, but of course they've got Taiwan and China to worry about. But I think, you know, all the time we've got Americans saying things that we're a sort of an adjunct of China. You just think, actually, how can you do business with people like that? Keir Starmer needs to turn his back on it and move away.
So if he's going to learn lessons from Australia and Canada, and I think that neither Albanese or Carney the most charismatic of politicians, are they? So they did have this message of unity in those countries, if that doesn't sound too fluffy. Is that something that Labour can start to engender? You know, this thing of we're all, if the Tories use this phrase, they're all in it together, so they'd have to come up with something better than that. But is there a way in which we could pull the country together, Jim, under that sort of unity flag? Because that is, as I say, what Canada and Australia did. And I suppose what both of those characters did in Carney and Albanese, they identified an enemy. Yeah. And bizarrely, the enemy was Donald Trump and America. Not sure Keir Starmer has got an enemy, has he, in that sense?
No, and you know, the Labour government is, through particularly John Healey, who's one of their better performers, in my opinion, the Defence Secretary, are trying to sort of, you know, assert, as they always do with their Union Jacks behind them, that they're fully patriotic, put all the Corbyn stuff behind them, and therefore they need to emphasise the military alliance with the United States, albeit, you know, it's in some doubt as to America's commitment to that alliance now. So it's difficult for them to identify an enemy. And they certainly, you know, they're certainly not going to go down the route of identifying Donald Trump as the enemy.
No.
But you can identify creeping fascism and, you know, crack down on travel, you know, trial with no trial, deportation. You can use the enemy of fascism quite effectively, I think, without necessarily saying it is Trump, although of course it is.
A worrying development in Eastern Europe. First round of the presidential poll in Romania. The guy who's won there, George Simeon, who Joe described off air as a 12-year-old. He's actually 38. He's won. He's the far-right alliance candidate for the Union of Romanians, very much on that Trump agenda, anti-EU, anti-immigration, and more concerning, I think, in the context of geopolitics, totally against supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. So, Jim, that is a worrying development, but I should point out this is the first round in the election, and although he won significant 40% of the vote, that does not necessarily mean he will ultimately be the victor. No,
I mean, and this has a history, because last year, when the elections got to this stage, the courts ruled that there had been foreign interference to support the right-wing candidate and cancelled the elections. And even more significantly, that seemed to annoy Vice President Vance in the United States, who said that Europe's got a problem with democracy. So where that leaves it now, I don't know. I mean, Romania is an important transit country for the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. So it's a complicated picture, and there's also a strip of Transnistria, I think it's called, which is actually very Russian dominated along that border with Moldova. So we'll see whether, you know, in the second round, when the Romanian people are faced with that alternative, they actually vote for a more centrist party. But one last thing about this is it does show the difficulties that Starmer and Macron have had in trying to get a sort of NATO response. You know, if the Americans are leaving the stage, what is NATO's response? And NATO is not a united force on these things. Hungary has its problems with it. You know, so that's why they desperately want to try and keep the sort of overarching American umbrella. So Romania may be an obscure country, but it is quite significant, and you're right to draw our attention to it on this podcast.
Joe?
Well, I would just say that on the 11th of May, not getting quite so much attention is the Albanian elections. And I think this is really important because they've already started talks about joining the EU. And it is highly likely that the socialist leader who's been there since 2013 will be re-elected. But again, you know, as Jim rightly says, it is about where we sit as a bloc geographically and politically and in terms of defence and security. So I think these Romanian and Albanian elections are really important, but I think we should all take succour from the results. As The Guardian said after the Australia election, another Trump on the Barbie.
Well, that's a good line to end this week's podcast on. And it's been great to have your company on this Bank Holiday Monday, VE Day, of course. The irony when we're talking about some of the issues of NATO and the fracturing of the alliance. But if you are doing any celebrations for VE Day, please do enjoy. Hope the weather holds for you. We'll be back next week. We haven't even had a chance to talk about Plymouth's relegation, but no doubt we can touch upon that at a future time. Have a great 7 days, everyone. See you in the downtown den again next week.